4,000 years. That is how long the era we now call the Dark Ages is said to have lasted, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD to the dawn of Europe's Renaissance. But when we turn back the brittle pages of time, what greets us first is not darkness, but silence. A hollow stillness, almost unnatural, where the echo of once vibrant civilizations seems to vanish from history's stage. We are told this millennium was drenched in chaos, ignorance, and blind superstition. That creativity dried up, that progress froze, and no genius stirred. But ask yourself, how does a continent that once birthed Aristotle, Cicero, and Archimedes suddenly fall into complete intellectual slumber for 1,000 years? And more crucially, who decided to call it dark in the first place? The answer points not to invading tribes or natural disasters, but to something more calculated. The church, or, more precisely, the gatekeepers who rose in its name, became the stewards of knowledge and memory after the Roman state dissolved. As the secular world crumbled, the Christian church ascended, not merely as a source of faith, but as the solitary power that survived the storm. And yet, the light it offered, was it meant to guide, or to blind? Great libraries, temples of learning, and ancient schools were raised or sanitized in the name of religious purity. Scrolls in Greek, secular Latin, and Coptic quietly disappeared, leaving no trace but smoke. Only what was rewritten copied painstakingly into doctrinal Latin and made legible only to monks trained for decades. These fragments, these filtered relics, were locked away within the monastic halls and ultimately within the Vatican's secret vaults. No competing power remained. No independent scholars stood to verify or question. For centuries, Europe's past was whatever the church permitted it to be. So, were the Dark Ages truly a time of civilizational decay? Or was it the engineered silence of a world being rewritten from the shadows? Maybe history wasn't lost. Maybe it was hidden carefully, methodically, and with purpose. And if that's true, then the real question isn't with a pen, but who doesn't want you to know it ever did? Tonight, let's drift with bedtime history through the cracks of forgotten time, because in those scattered remnants, those fractured echoes, we might just recover something that was meant to be buried. The truth about history, the world, and perhaps even ourselves. The year was 476. That's the official death knell of Rome, when Romulus Augustulus, a child emperor, was quietly deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer. An empire that had once ruled the known Western world simply ended without a final battle, without even a eulogy. But the eerie part is this: no one living at the time referred to it as the end of anything. No public mourning echoed through the forum. No chronicles recorded the empire's fall in real time. And stranger still, no immediate accounts explain what came next. You'd expect such a monumental shift to leave behind a wealth of documents, scrolls, and testimonies, but instead, from the 5th to the 8th centuries, the historical record grows disturbingly thin. It's as if Europe collectively fell into a coma, or worse. Someone wanted it to look that way. And amid this vanishing act, one force keeps reappearing in the haze: the church. With the fall of political Rome, spiritual Rome rose like a phoenix, a persecuted sect transformed into a dominant institution. Now wielding a power even emperors never held, the power not only to shape faith, but to control memory. Who curated history in this age? Not universities, they were extinct. Not scholars, they were exiled, executed, or absorbed. Only monks, hidden behind monastery walls, decided what knowledge lived and what was left to fade. Ancient stories, scientific works, triumphs, and failures all sifted through a theological lens. Even the early popes of this twilight era, Pope Felix III, Gelasius I, and Hilaire, are enveloped in mystery. Were they historical figures or convenient symbols crafted in hindsight? Between 500 and 800 AD, Europe's timeline doesn't merely fade, it collapses. Across the continent, silence settles like dust. Cities like Milan, Cologne, and Lyon produced no new literature, no art, no architecture, no maps, and eerily, no stories. Meanwhile, beyond Europe, the world thrived. In Thames Dynasty China, printing technology, music, and poetry reached celestial heights. In the Arab world, minds like Al-Khwarizmi redefined mathematics, hospitals, libraries, and astronomical discoveries flourished. The Library of Baghdad brimmed with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts while Europe forgot the compass even existed. So why did only Europe descend into historical amnesia? Who benefited from this forgetting? The answer lies not in foreign invasions or cultural decline, but in the quiet, unwavering force that remained, the Church. When people are taught that their ancestors were ignorant, they stop asking questions. When knowledge is buried in books, cease to exist, curiosity dies before it can be born. When exploration is deemed heretical, the mind stays tethered to the pulpit. The Vatican didn't need to suppress through fire and sword, only through narrative. It needed only to define one word: darkness. And from that seed, fear grew like a forest. It's tempting to think that nothing happened because nothing remains. But sometimes, the deepest silence is the loudest proof of a concealed crime, the deliberate erasure of human progress. Because history isn't just what occurred, it's what was allowed to be remembered. And when only those in robes are left to write the chapters, the story becomes not a reflection of truth, but a scripture of control. When Rome fell, so too did the scaffolding of secular learning. Libraries shut their doors, schools decayed, scholars scattered or bent the knee. Only in isolated monasteries behind cold stone walls did knowledge persist, stripped, censored, and narrowly curated. Rays of truth were allowed to slip through cracks, but only those approved by cloistered hands. And within that suffocating silence lies the detail, too often overlooked. Asterisk. Ancient Roman and Greek texts were not merely transcribed, they were reshaped, rewritten into ecclesiastical Latin, a version of the language that bore the fingerprints of theology, narrower in meaning, more cryptic in syntax, and intelligible only to a specially trained clerical elite. Where classical Latin once served the courts of law, the forums of politics, the halls of science and literature, Church Latin became the gatekeeper of knowledge. Not a bridge to enlightenment, but a lock sealing away the accumulated wisdom of civilizations past. And the consequences were profound. The mathematical revelations of Pythagoras, the political frameworks of Cicero, and the natural philosophy of Aristotle, if they conflicted with church doctrine, they were not preserved. They were reinterpreted, censored, or ignored altogether. Thousands of manuscripts, labeled pagan, heretical, or simply unnecessary for the salvation of souls, were deliberately left to rot, burned into ash, or hidden in vaults where they would never be seen again. Knowledge ceased to be a torch passed from generation to generation. It became a tool tightly held, carefully guarded, and ruthlessly filtered. In this new order, to seek history meant to pass through a priest. To read an ancient text required authorization, and if granted, one was taught not to question, but to accept. There was no room for independent verification. Intellectual dissent was forbidden. Debate silenced. In this climate, history did not evolve, aspified. Doctrine was no longer one interpretation of truth. It became truth itself. It's often said that history is written by the victors, but in this case, the victors didn't need to fabricate a new past. They only had to keep what suited them and allow the rest to quietly disappear. And so, deep within the stone walls of monasteries, history was rewritten not with weapons, but with ink and silence. There are silences in history so vast, so all-consuming they make us wonder, did those centuries truly exist? A controversial idea known as the phantom time hypothesis shook the scholarly world in the late 20th century. It proposes that nearly 300 years spanning from approximately 614 to 911 AD were artificially inserted into the timeline. In other words, we may be living in a calendar that includes Centurius that never actually occurred. At first glance, the theory seems absurd, but when one begins to examine the historical gaps, the contradictions, and the eerie patterns in Europe's recorded timeline, a sense of unease begins to grow. Why are there so few consistent, verifiable records from that period? Why do accounts from different regions diverge wildly in dating the same events? Why do certain rulers, battles, and dynasties seem like rebranded repetitions of earlier history? Take Charlemagne, for instance, a towering figure of the 9th century. His reign mirrors that of Constantine the Great from the 4th century with striking precision. Military conquests, imperial reforms, religious decrees, all seemingly copied, repurposed. Could it be coincidence or deliberate replication? And who would have both the means and the motive to manipulate something as sacred as time itself? Historians have pointed to three key figures: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor; Gerbert of Aurillac, the brilliant monk who became Pope Sylvester II; and, inevitably, the Vatican. If history could be extended or compressed at will, rulers could align their reigns with divine prophecy. Kingdoms could legitimize power through fabricated continuity. And most crucially, the Church could frame its authority as part of a preordained, unbroken legacy stretching back through an illusion of centuries. The Vatican has never officially addressed the phantom time hypothesis. They neither confirm nor deny. And therein lies the strategy. Their silence is not indifference, it is control. Because by refusing to engage, they maintain absolute ambiguity. And when you control both the knowledge and the timeline, you do not need to argue. You only need to wait. We may be living not within an accurate reflection of the past, but within a curated version of it, edited, like a theological manuscript, shaped by those who understood how to wield time as a silent instrument of dominion, not with swords, but with calendars. Perhaps the world we inhabit is not just fragmented, is staged. A theater where history has been choreographed, where truth and fiction blur not in the stories we tell, but in the very chronology we trust. Look closely at the official list of popes between the 8th and 10th centuries, as recorded by the Vatican. You'll find names, titles, and dates each pope hailed as the vicar of Christ on earth. But here's the unsettling truth. For many of them, there exists no firm evidence they ever lived. No personal letters, no contemporary chronicles, no physical trace. Just names, just echoes. And perhaps that is the most haunting silence of all. Asterisk asterisk from Pope Sabinian and Stephen III, to obscure names like Valentine, Donus II, and even John XIV. The records of many early pontiffs exist solely within documents, preserved by the Vatican without a single independent verification from secular sources. No relics unearthed, no eyewitness chronicles. No historically significant actions are attributed to them, merely sparse biographical notes, often vague and second-hand. And so secular historians now ask the unthinkable: did these popes truly exist? Or were they inserted retroactively, crafted to fill in the hollowed-out timelines of an era that may have been altered or fabricated entirely? Rewriting the papal lineage is not just about safeguarding memory. It is about wielding power. If, in the 11th century, a pope wished to assert that his authority flowed directly from Christ through St. Peter, then there could be no interruptions in that sacred line. Each name, each reign, had to form an unbroken chain, regardless of whether history agreed. And if centuries of darkness marred the record, the solution was as simple as it was audacious: create the missing links, insert the names, fill the gaps, rewrite reality. But it didn't stop with the popes. Many saints, now canonized and venerated, are figures for whom no archaeological trace or historical proof exists beyond oral tradition and theological legend. Curiously, their lives, martyrdoms, and miracles are almost always said to have taken place precisely during the periods modern scholars now suspect to be historically void. Coincidence or construction. Convenient relics, bones, shrouds, artifacts seem to emerge at just the right moment, as though summoned to flesh out a narrative written long before the evidence appeared. And in that narrative, the Vatican was not merely an archivist of truth, it was the architect of history itself. What did this achieve? It forged a version of the past that radiated sanctity, continuity, and divine legitimacy. A storyline that made the Church appear timeless, eternal, and immune to the erosion of doubt. A power ordained not by consensus, but by God Himself. And so no one dared to ask, if one pope was a fiction, how many more chapters of history were? Carefully crafted illusions designed to preserve control. When memory is shaped not by evidence, but by belief, and belief is curated by those who guard the past, truth ceases to be an absolute. It becomes conditional, selective, permitted. But there is one realm where truth cannot be altered: the heavens. A total solar eclipse recorded at a precise location and time can be predicted with extraordinary accuracy across both past and future. It is a celestial clock, immune to politics, theology, or human interference. For this reason, astronomy has long been the most reliable tool in authenticating historical timelines. And yet, when modern researchers compared known astronomical phenomena with historical dates from medieval Europe, something alarming emerged. The stars didn't align. Eclipses documented in ancient Chinese, Jewish, and Greco-Roman records often have no counterpart in Western accounts during the so-called Dark Ages. Conversely, events in European chronicles allegedly occurring during or marked by celestial signs took place under skies that, according to astrophysics, were clear. These discrepancies were not matters of hours or days. They spanned decades, centuries. So what happens when the sky itself contradicts the written word? In medieval Europe, astronomers were not encouraged to follow the truth. They were expected to align their findings with the Church's established chronology. If a celestial event didn't match doctrine, it was dismissed as error or worse, labeled heresy. Some even claimed such inconsistencies were tricks of the devil himself. We forget that the Vatican once held immense influence over the most brilliant astronomers in the Western world, long before the Vatican Observatory was formally established in the 16th century. The stars were already being tracked by monks and clergy quietly, privately. Their observations formed a secret chronicle of time itself, a chronicle never shared, a map of truth, kept behind walls of authority, because to control astronomy is to control time. And so, history was quietly bent to fit the Church's sacred narrative. The stars did not lie, but men chose to rewrite what the stars declared. Today, with modern algorithms and digital precision, we can retroactively calculate astronomical events to the exact minute, and the gaps in medieval European history are harder than ever to explain. Events once proclaimed sacred, supposedly validated by eclipses or celestial omens, leave no trace in the firmament, nothing, and through it all, the Vatican remained silent. During the long medieval silence, those who dared to challenge the Church's cosmological narrative paid dearly. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. Galileo Galilei was forced to recant, not because he was wrong, but because he dared to touch the forbidden, the cosmic clock, unbound by human hands. Because once a civilization loses its grip on when it is in time, its memory becomes pliable. Stories can be inserted, eras can be erased, and myths can pass as fact. By controlling the light of the sky, the Vatican shaped how humanity would forever see the darkness. It is often said that after the collapse of Rome, Europe plunged into nearly 1,000 years of intellectual sleep. A people without maps, without oceans to cross, without any concept of the broader world. But if that's true, where did the maps come from? Some ancient cartographic works defy explanation. The most famous is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513. It depicts with startling accuracy the coasts of South America, the western edge of Africa, and even a portion of Antarctica centuries before it was officially discovered, and with contours that match the continent as it would appear free of ice. According to Piri Reis himself, the map was compiled using older source materials documents whose origins remain unknown. Maps from an age that, by official accounts, should not have had this knowledge. How could Renaissance cartographers possess such data before the age of exploration? And more pressingly, where are those source maps now? Scholars, archaeologists, and independent researchers all point in one direction: the Vatican's secret archives, hidden beneath the surface of Rome, behind layers of secrecy and classification. The Vatican holds one of the world's largest collections of ancient maps, and yet, less than 1% of that collection has ever been made public. The rest remains buried, along with the truth. The rest remains sealed and traceable, unexamined, and deliberately uncopied. And within those delicate, dust-covered parchments lie clues not only of forgotten knowledge but also of geographic insight that defies the boundaries of accepted history. Coastlines appear centuries before their official discovery. Entire continents are sketched long before explorers set foot on their shores. Islands, once charted in intricate detail, have vanished entirely from modern maps. Voyages unrecorded in any textbook match perfectly with satellite data we possess today. These revelations force us to ask a far more unsettling question. Was medieval Europe truly blind and ignorant, as we've always been told? Or did a hidden caste of scholars, clerics, and cartographers possess knowledge far ahead of their time, only to be silenced or replaced by an edited version of history? If such maps are held within the Vatican, what are they truly protecting? A sacred truth, a monopoly on power, or a vision of the world that, if revealed, could append the entire architecture of our historical understanding? A map is not just a navigational instrument. It is a declaration of where we stand in the cosmos. And if you don't know where you are, anyone can dictate your direction. And for centuries, the Vatican has held that power. The ability to redraw the contours of the known world, and then bury it in ink and secrecy. When maps vanish, history doesn't simply disappear. It becomes a labyrinth, a construct where we are guided not by truth, but by permission. Perhaps, buried deep beneath the layered stone of the Apostolic Palace, the real map still lies intact, but it has never been shown to you. We are taught that after the fall of Rome, Europe entered a millennium-long darkness. That knowledge was lost, that the stars fell silent, that science became superstition, and that the grandeur of civilization crumbled into dust. According to this narrative, Europe wandered aimlessly through the ruins of its own forgotten greatness. But what if that story is not history, but strategy? What if that image was designed not to inform, but to obscure? All across Europe, evidence whispers a different tale. Sophisticated bronze gears, unearthed in what is now Germany, are dated precisely to the Dark Ages. Complex astronomical devices, hidden within silent monastery chambers, geothermal systems, and anti-gravity vaults lying beneath shepherd villages' places, untouched by any recorded Roman influence. Who built them? And who sustained such knowledge in an age we were told was blind? Mainstream historians wave them off as anomalies, curiosities, or mistakes in the record. And as with all truths that challenge institutional acivist, they are shelved, silenced, forgotten. The Vatican, again, says nothing. But silence from such an institution is never mere absence. It is strategy. It is refusal without confrontation. Let us not forget many archaeological sites across Europe, especially in lands once controlled by the Church, require ecclesiastical oversight. Artifacts disappear for preservation, only to never resurface. A handful of courageous independent archaeologists have spoken up, only to be labeled radicals, stripped of their funding, or shut out from dig sites. They are cast aside with a familiar insult: conspiracy theorists. Even when their discoveries hold the power to unravel everything, we accept as history, so we must ask, did Europe truly lose its legacy? Or was it locked away to uphold a more useful illusion? A narrative of darkness and ignorance ensures that any light later introduced appears divine, miraculous, and necessary. But a Europe that had never truly lost Rome's light, one that had innovated, questioned, and discovered, would threaten any institution that sought to monopolize salvation, authority, or truth. And thus, by shaping the myth of backwardness, the Church ensured it alone could be seen as the bringer of enlightenment. The Vatican need not lie to preserve power. It need only maintain the story. And silence, when strategically wielded, becomes more potent than any decree. Not all truths are buried in ruins. Some are preserved, stalled, rationed, delayed, and in delay lies the ultimate dominion. Look closer, and a disturbing pattern reveals itself. From the collapse of Rome to the rise of the Renaissance, the current of invention slowed to a crawl. Mechanisms as simple as the rotating shaft mastered by the Greeks did not reappear for nearly 1,000 years. The works of Archimedes, Galen, and Aristotle vanished, only to re-emerge as if newly conceived. This was no coincidence. It was management. And again, we return to the one constant: the Vatican. For centuries, it was the central authority over the written word, keeper of monasteries, guardian of libraries, and gatekeeper of education. It did not destroy knowledge, it curated it, and more dangerously, it delayed it. When religious authority governs both the soul and the timeline, progress becomes a controlled substance. A Bible alone in a monk's hand will not birth astronomy. A people taught to fear heresy will not dissect the heavens or the human body. What we call the Dark Ages may not have been an absence of knowledge, but the presence of a masterfully enforced delay. Time itself became a tool. When you control the calendar, you control remembrance. When you set the timeline, you dictate what is possible and when. You determine who appears to illuminate Thorold and who is cast forever in shadow. The Vatican did not merely document history, it sculpted it. It staggered the flow of knowledge so that when the Renaissance bloomed, it was the Church that stood at the center, appearing to rediscover what it had long concealed. No war was needed, no armies marched, only the quiet mastery of the timeline, altered just enough to slow a civilization's breath. And so, beneath the oldest vaults of the Holy See, sealed behind names no one outside the clergy may speak, lies the greatest archive of delayed truth. The Archivum Secretum, not destroyed, not denied, simply postponed. Asterisk, a place whose very name conjures a quiet dread among scholars, not because of superstition, but because of the untold weight it carries. This is no legend. The Vatican's secret archive exists solid, silent, and impenetrable. Yet, in all of modern history, no individual has ever been granted unfettered access. There are no public visits, no transparent catalogs, and no photographs that show its true interior. Even the most decorated university professors and global researchers must navigate a labyrinth of bureaucracy, enduring endless layers of approvals, rigid time constraints, severe limitations on what can be viewed, and an unyielding rule: nothing may ever be copied or removed. Within its stone walls lie over 50 kilometers of shelving, more than 1 million documents. Stretching from the 8th century to the modern day, what we know of it is merely the surface. What remains unseen, the hidden core, is the most potent. No pope has walked every corridor, and no bishop has laid bare its contents. The full layout is a classified map, shielded even from those closest to the institution. Whispers persist of ancient texts removed from biblical canon. Secret records of heresy and forbidden rites. Papal journals scribbled in despair and confession. and perhaps most astonishing of all, maps that portray the Earth in ways that defy what our schools and history books have taught. What makes the Vatican Archive exceptional isn't just its volume, it is its deliberate inaccessibility. Centuries ago, the Church redefined the Latin term secretum, not as secret in the modern sense, but as private. It was a masterstroke in semantics, divine sleight of hand. We're not hiding anything, they say. We're simply keeping it reserved. But when what is kept reserved may contain the true story of humanity, can we still call it an archive? Or does it become something else entirely, a fortress of forgotten truths? No one knows precisely what is locked away. But this much is clear. If there exists any single place on Earth capable of safeguarding the lost pieces of civilization's puzzle, it is here, not because of how much it holds, but because of the absolute silence that protects it. In this place, where even monarchs and scholars are denied entry, we are reminded that real power may not sit on a throne, it may rest on a shelf. A forgotten manuscript no one has been allowed to open. There are texts not lost to fire, nor destroyed by time or war, but hidden deliberately, meticulously, and with great intent. According to the rare few granted restricted access, some documents predate the Middle Ages, and even the founding of the Christian Church. They are not foreign artifacts. They are relics of Europe's own intellectual past, an era before knowledge was eclipsed by dogma. Some are penned in archaic tongues, perhaps pre-Latin dialects, or suppressed forms of Greek, containing celestial maps, medical diagrams, and philosophies so profound they shatter the theological mold imposed centuries later. Why are they concealed? Because they unravel the story we have been taught. If Europe once possessed advanced scientific and spiritual knowledge during the so-called Dark Ages, the myth that Christendom alone restored the light of civilization begins to falter. If wisdom once flowed outside Scripture, then the Church's authority over truth would crumble. Imagine a 4th century manuscript describing non-Euclidean geometry, or a text explaining planetary motion in elliptical orbits long before Kepler's time, or a medical compendium from Gaul, written in a forgotten blend of Latin and Celtic, containing remedies modern medicine still cannot replicate. These works weren't erased by accident, they were hidden by design. And stranger still, whenever fragments surface a page, a quote, a scroll, they are swiftly retrieved, always under the banner of reservation, or the noble-sounding claim of protecting the faithful. But truth, if it is truly truth, does not need shadows to survive. It needs light. It needs to breathe. Yet the Vatican, as both guardian and gatekeeper, has claimed for itself the divine right to decide what is dangerous. And dangerous here does not mean false. It means too true, too soon. These manuscripts may still sit in pristine condition, preserved within climate-controlled vaults, untouched by time. But until they are read, shared, and known, they remain as good as destroyed. This is not simply historical censorship. It is the most insidious form of erasure ever conceived, knowledge, preserved not to enlighten, but to suppress. Perhaps no text in history has been as thoroughly controlled as the Bible. More than a holy book, it has served as the foundation for laws, empires, and the structure of Western civilization itself. But what most believers never hear is this: the Bible we know today is not the original. It is the result of centuries of redactions, exclusions, and strategic silences. The Church does not deny this, but it has never explained what was left out, or why. Scholars label these forbidden texts as apocrypha, but the term is misleading. It does not mean false, it simply means not authorized for public reading. Among these lost Gospels lie extraordinary revelations: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Judas. These writings do not depict Jesus as a distant divine authority, but as a radical teacher urging personal enlightenment, inner freedom, and a direct relationship with truth, one that renders institutional mediation unnecessary. If such ideas were embraced, What need would there be for a church to act as the voice of God? Other texts speak of pre-Adamic civilizations, cataclysmic cycles of destruction and rebirth, and radiant beings not bound to the visible world ideas that run counter to the doctrine the Vatican has enforced for millennia. Rather than open these ideas to inquiry, the Church branded them heresies. Possessing such a manuscript could once mean torture, execution, or life imprisonment. And yet many of these texts were quietly preserved in monastic libraries, hand-copied, by monks who must have sensed that one day the hidden truth would demand its resurrection. Today, that day draws nearer, and the question is no longer what lies within those walls, but how much longer humanity will tolerate its own history being buried beneath a lock, behind a door, under a church whose silence has lasted far too long. Asterisk though. Fragments of these works have been declassified and reprinted. The Vatican still refuses to acknowledge their doctrinal value. Officially, they remain silent, shielded by the sanctity of tradition. But as the years pass, a more haunting question begins to surface. If these writings are truly meaningless, why conceal them with such calculated care? Perhaps what the Vatican fears most is not blind belief in forbidden words, but the spark of curiosity they might ignite. For in the arc of human history, every genuine awakening has begun with a question once dismissed as harmless. Not all wars are waged with swords or steel. Some are silent, fought in shadows with no armies, only ideas. And these wars, waged against knowledge itself, can imprison the mind of a civilization for centuries. In the Middle Ages, particularly during what we call the Dark Ages, to question doctrine, to explore forbidden ideas, or to be too curious, was to risk being declared a heretic, and heresy was not a crime taken lightly. Consider the case of Giordano Bruno, philosopher, cosmologist, Dominican friar, not a rebel, but a seeker. He believed so deeply in the vastness of creation that he could not accept a universe with only one center. He proposed the radical idea that stars were, and that beyond them lay infinite worlds. He refused to reduce God to the words of Scripture. For this, only this, he was burned alive in Rome's Campo dei Fiori in 1600, amidst murmured prayers and the cold silence of a sacred court. Bruno was one of thousands. Monks who translated ancient texts, healers who studied forgotten medicine, astronomers who dared trace the stars, all faced the charge of heresy. No evidence was needed, just suspicion. Sentences ranged from lifelong imprisonment and public torture to being tied to a stake and set ablaze to purify the soul. People speak of the Inquisition as an era of religious horror, but few realize it was a near-perfect machine, engineered not just to destroy people, but to extinguish ideas. Books were not debated, they were incinerated, manuscripts erased, knowledge vaporized before it could spread. A single book, decades in the making, could vanish in minutes. More terrifying still, the silence that followed made future generations forget they ever existed. In that climate, silence was survival. Curiosity was death. And over time, silence became something worse: complicity. A whole continent drifted into a coma of thought, lulled by fear and ritual. The Vatican, with its dual authority as spiritual shepherd and political empire, didn't need to win arguments. It only needed to maintain control, root out those who awakened, and that alone was enough to bury truth in eternal dusk. We often imagine medieval monks as gentle souls, cloistered in candlelit chambers, copying scripture in peace. But beneath this romantic image lay a vast and disciplined network siren, far-reaching, acting more like an intelligence service than a brotherhood of prayer. Their mission, knowledge. After the fall of empires and the ruin of great libraries, the Church initiated a quiet crusade to retrieve every surviving manuscript before it fell into dangerous hands. The agents of this mission were not popes or kings, but monks, especially the Benedictines, who populated every major monastic center across Italy, France, England, and Germany. The Franciscans, originally focused on humility, became skilled at infiltrating communities. The Dominicans, future architects of the Inquisition, were precise and tireless. And the Jesuits, perhaps the most formidable of all, thinkers, strategists, utterly devoted to the Vatican's cause. Under the guise of preserving the faith, these monks gained access to libraries, homes, and scholars across Europe. They arrived not with weapons, but with prayers and polite requests. Their satchels were left full. Over time, countless ancient texts, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Persian works of science, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were quietly absorbed. They were borrowed and never returned. Libraries that once housed thousands of books were reduced to shelves of scripture. Anything that contradicted doctrine was not burned. That would be crude. No, their church was more elegant. Such works were simply hidden, locked away in vaults. Their existence was neither denied nor confirmed. The Vatican's secret Archivum Secretum became the tomb for civilization's collective memory. Through these subterranean monastic channels, the Church gathered not just the faith of the Western world, but its very history. For centuries, these monks were not merely men of God, they were archivists, censors, and erasers. They didn't need to destroy knowledge. Owning it was enough. They didn't need to silence debate. Their silence was the debate, and as the light of ancient wisdom disappeared behind monastery walls, a lie took root that the world had always been dark. Because the lamp had been hidden, people believed there had never been light. When the wisdom of the ages is held in a single hand, and all others are left in shadow, history repeats a brutal pattern. Someone will try to keep that light only for themselves, but not everyone bowed. Not all thinkers perished in flames. Some survived not by betraying knowledge, but by hiding with it. Over generations, in whispers and symbols, a counterforce began to form. Secret societies. Their origins are obscure, undocumented, but between the 11th and 14th centuries, strange signs began to appear. Esoteric carvings in crypts, hidden geometry in cathedrals, architecture too sophisticated for its time. At the heart of this movement, the Freemasons. Born as master builders, they became guardians of ancient knowledge. Cloaked in rituals, symbols, and secrecy, they formed an invisible fellowship bound not by land or language, but by memory, preserving what the Church tried to erase. Adorned with symbols that bore no connection to Christianity, the sun, the moon, the all-seeing eye, spirals, and sacred geometries, these were not merely decorations, but encrypted messages. The Rosicrucians, a shadowy brotherhood shrouded in legend, were said to guard a lineage of ancient wisdom tracing back to Egypt and Babylon. Knowledge, preserved not through open declarations, but in veiled manuscripts and allegorical riddles, passed from hand to hand. The alchemists, long vilified by the Church as witches and heretics, were in fact the earliest scientists, chemists, natural philosophers, seekers of truth, far beyond the confines of sanctioned belief. Across these disparate groups ran a common thread, not a rejection of religion, but a refusal to surrender to its imposed boundaries. They believed in a primordial stream of truth, older and purer than any creed truth, that predated and, in their eyes, outshone the structures later erected to redefine reality. And they suspected, with reason, that the Vatican had seized that ancient knowledge, hoarded it, entombed it behind stone and silence. That is why so many Masonic emblems read like visual ciphers, blueprints for awakening, hidden in plain sight, during a time when speech could lead to fire. The square and compass, the letter G, representing God, geometry, and gnosis, were more than artistic motifs. They were keys. Keys only the initiated could use to unlock long-buried truths. These secret orders never declared war on the Church, but they did what the Church feared most. They remembered. In silence and secrecy, they became the other half of the scale, the counterweight to monopoly. They did not seek power, only to ensure that the flame of wisdom, though dimmed, would not die out. And this leads to a provocative realization. If forbidden societies could guard fragments of the truth for centuries, then total control was never complete. No matter how fiercely history is manipulated, it always leaves fingerprints. And sometimes, it is the quiet watchers on the margins who hold the last unbroken thread, the one that can unravel the lies and lead us out of the manufactured night. Because whenever truth is centralized, when the light of knowledge is seized by a few, and all others are cast into darkness, an inevitable reaction begins. Someone, somewhere, will find a way to keep a spark alive. Not all bowed their heads. Not every thinker was burned. Some survived, not by betraying wisdom, but by vanishing with it. And across centuries, slowly but purposefully, they began to reappear, like whispers carved into cathedrals, like riddles etched into forgotten crypts. Thus, the secret societies were born. There is no precise timestamp for their genesis, but from the 11th to 14th centuries, their presence started appearing in architecture, in art, and in glyphs, too deliberate to be coincidence. The Freemasons, perhaps the most visible among them, began as master builders, architects of cathedrals, and of meaning itself. But brick by brick, they built more than temples. They erected a network of intellect, ritual, and encoded resilience. Through architecture and allegory, they protected what others sought to erase. They became living vaults of knowledge, moving beneath the surface of sanctioned history. Because in any regime of control, the greatest weapon isn't the sword or the treasury, it's the power to shape thought and to control thought. One doesn't need to silence speech. One needs only to make sure there's nothing left worth speaking. You drain the people not with fear, but with absence. And once knowledge is stripped away, obedience becomes natural, through oppression, but through emptiness. That is how the Dark Ages truly began, not as a lack of progress, but as a deliberate smothering of potential, a spiritual starvation. Within the monasteries, monks tirelessly copied the Bible, but seldom Aristotle, seldom Archimedes or Ptolemy unless filtered through the church's lens. And within the churches, the faithful were fed sermons of sin and salvation, yet were left blind to social structures, history's true currents, or the potency of their own language. Each new generation inherited a smaller world, a thinner truth, and they were told, this is all there is. And so, ignorance became holiness. To know little was to be devout. To ask too much was to risk damnation. The pursuit of knowledge, a sacred endeavor, was branded arrogance, even heresy. But make no mistake, this was no innocent lapse in curiosity. It was cultivated and protected, weaponized. In many places, literacy itself was outlawed for the masses. Reading became a privilege, tightly guarded. Even monks were forbidden access to large portions of scripture, lest they interpret it wrongly. A divine monopoly on understanding was enforced, not with violence alone, but with scarcity. And the church didn't need to dominate every continent. It simply had to cloud the sky. A fog of unknowing fell over the world, and, in that fog, truth slept. But somewhere, tucked between stone and shadow, others were waking. Asterisk, asterisk. And when you spend your whole life surrounded by fog, you begin to believe it is daylight. This is the cruel brilliance of mental domination. It does not arrive with a sword or chains. It comes gently, slowly, silently, not through force, but through time and forgetfulness. Centuries of stillness, where no one recalls that there once existed a world where questions were not just allowed, but encouraged. And here lies the most terrifying truth. When ignorance becomes tradition, those who still remember the truth are seen as dangerous. The cycle begins again, and when the Vatican holds the keys to both the past and the future, it need not shout, threaten, or punish. It need only remain silent. That silence becomes the lullaby that rocks us into collective sleep or dream, where truth is optional and light is something rationed. dispensed only when it serves the keepers of the gate. The irony is harsh and biting. Science, born from wonder, from the human instinct to explore the cosmos and the soul, was once branded as evil, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. When Galileo Galilei turned his telescope skyward and dared to say that Earth was not the center of the universe, he wasn't merely speaking in equations. He was setting fire to a 1,000-year illusion, an illusion crafted to place mankind at the heart of all creation, under a sky ruled by divine decree and protected by scripture. The Vatican had invested centuries into that illusion, and for that single act of clarity, Galileo was summoned before the Inquisition, not because he lied, but because he told the truth too clearly. They made him kneel, forced him to recant under threat of punishment, and then buried him alive in the walls of his own home, not because he was a heretic, but because he saw too much, and worse. He said it aloud, asterisk, asterisk, but even before Galileo came others. Roger Bacon, a 13th century English thinker, imprisoned for exploring optics and experimentation. Michael Servetus, a physician who dared propose that blood moved in circuits, was burned alive for his beliefs. And beyond these few names lie thousands more voices extinguished, names erased, not because they were wrong, but because they thought beyond what was permitted. The war was never about science. It was never about facts or formulas. It was about ownership of truth. The moment the Vatican proclaimed that all knowledge must pass through the filter of doctrine, the battle lines were drawn. Any truth that didn't serve the doctrine was forbidden, even if it was undeniable. Medieval universities, most of them funded and controlled by the church, were not havens of intellectual liberty. They were echo chambers where students were trained not to think but to believe, where questioning dogma was the fastest path to exile, or worse. Ancient scientific works were either hidden in monastic vaults or made accessible only to those deemed safe. Knowledge was not shared, it was caged. And then came something darker, the birth of fear. A collective fear that seeped into the bones of entire generations. People stopped thinking not because they were incapable, but because they were terrified. A single stray thought, a single unapproved theory, and the punishment could be swift and brutal. The mind became a prison unto itself. Science, once the shining child of human inquiry, became a fugitive in the lands that had once cradled it, driven out, disfigured, and hunted not for being false, but for being free. It wasn't until centuries later, through the intellectual uprisings of the Renaissance and the radical awakenings of the Enlightenment, that humanity began to shake off the invisible chains it had worn for so long. Chains forged not of iron, but of ignorance and fear. But by then, how many centuries had been sacrificed to silence? How many ideas suffocated before ever reaching the surface? How many truths were murdered in their infancy, before they even had a name? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many of those truths remain buried, locked away in vaults untouched by light, where the dust of time protects them more securely than any guard? Imagine an age where minds could carve rivers through deserts, sketch architecture 1,000 years ahead of its time, and read the stars as if they were written in their native tongue. Then picture it all vanishing, not in fire, not by sword or flood, but through deliberate omission, erased because it did not align with the tale that power wished to tell. For nearly a millennium, from the collapse of Rome to the rise of the Renaissance, Europe is said to have drifted into a kind of slumber, a great silence where invention, science, and progress lay still. A chapter in history pressed under a great pause. And yet, curiously, elsewhere, the world was awake. In those same centuries, China gave birth to the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. The Islamic world performed surgeries, mapped optics, and translated every known Greek manuscript into Arabic. India explored the cosmos, decoded numbers, and developed medicine from nature's own language. But Europe, under The firm grip of the church seemed to forget the art of knowing, not because it was barren of thinkers, but because those bursts of brilliance were smothered, erased, and buried under legends and myths. Geniuses may have walked its lands, engineers, philosophers, scientists, but their work was swallowed into silence, their names replaced by stories of miracles. If a cathedral too grand to explain stood before them, no one praised the builder, they venerated a saint. They said the stone was holy, the walls divine, and the labor invisible. Machines became gifts from heaven, knowledge, divine revelation, and so the miraculous became the mask for everything forbidden to be understood. But this wasn't harmless myth-making, it was a quiet theft, a theft of human dignity, of the belief that we are capable of truth. It strangled the instinct to and replaced it with the urge to worship, so that generations would never dare to wonder. If not a miracle, then what? Who carved these wonders? What knowledge did they hold? And why was it never passed on? Some say fragments of that forgotten brilliance survive in the margins of ancient maps, in coded diagrams, and in manuscripts locked away in the secret vaults of the Vatican. Untranslatable glyphs, blueprints that defy their era, writings no one dares to decode. Because when miracle is the explanation, even the question becomes heresy. And thus, piece by piece, curiosity was replaced by doctrine. The creators were forgotten, only the miracle endured. And in that collective amnesia, power found its perfect shield. You don't need chains when children are raised in a prison they mistake for a school. You don't need violence if you can mold memory itself, starting with textbooks. For centuries, education wasn't a ladder toward freedom, it was a tool of control. Especially in medieval Europe, where the Vatican dominated the entire system from the alphabet, a child first risked to the ideas they were never permitted to touch. A child born into that world would be taught that Earth sat immobile at the center of the cosmos, that man was sculpted in a week, that the Bible contained every truth worth knowing, and if the world outside disagreed, the fault was not in the scripture, it was in the student. From the very first lesson, children were taught to believe before they understood, and to memorize before they questioned. Critical thinking wasn't discouraged, was condemned. For in that system, blind faith was the supreme virtue, and obedience the ultimate wisdom. But perhaps more dangerous than what children were taught was what they weren't. They weren't told of the Greeks, the Persians, the Indians, or the Chinese. They weren't shown the surgical tools of Baghdad or the mathematics of Nalanda. They weren't taught that truth can come from human minds, not just from sacred texts. Instead, they were taught that all wisdom flowed from a single divine authority, through one earthly gatekeeper, the church. And this was no accident. It was design. Because when a child is raised on a false foundation, they don't just lack answers, they forget to ask questions. They grow up believing the world has always been as it is. That knowledge is a gift handed down by priests, not drawn out by inquiry. And so, entire generations were trained not in faith, but in submission. The truth didn't need to be hidden in a vault. It only needed to be replaced with simpler, safer stories, planted before a young mind ever learned to protect itself. That's why even now, large swaths of history remain blurred, distorted, or rewritten, not due to a lack of evidence but because of an ancient, lingering fear that if too many people know what truly happened, they'll start asking the most dangerous question of all. And when a people begin to question, power begins to tremble. When we imagine the manipulation of history, we often think of fires, consuming scrolls, scholars gagged by inquisitions, or secret books buried beneath the Vatican. But there is a subtler force, quieter, yet more enduring than fire, the school book. The 19th century, a time of steam, nationalism, and mass educations, saw European empires standardize public schooling. And in doing so, they rewrote the past for millions. It was in those classrooms that history was turned into a weapon. The very phrase "Dark Ages" was not born in the Middle Ages. It was a creation of 19th century scholars, reformers, and a narrative forged to glorify the present by degrading the past, by depicting the 1,000 years after Rome's fall as an abyss of ignorance. The elite of the 1800s could declare themselves saviors of civilization, and to do that, they had to make what came before seem like a nightmare, a time of witches, wars, and wandering minds. But why, you might ask, did the Vatican remain silent when the age it once ruled was painted in such darkness? Because it didn't need to speak. For centuries, through control of knowledge, it had already created the vacuum, a vacuum tailor-made to be called dark. And once that label was printed in textbooks, stamped across school walls, and passed from teacher to child, it became memory. From Paris to London and Berlin to Rome, students were taught a clean, linear myth: Greece, Rome, fall, darkness, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernity. It sounded neat. It felt true, but it left out everything. The forgotten breakthroughs in medieval medicine and astronomy. Fetich was carried by Islamic scientists. The deliberate suppression of any record that contradicted church authority. And so, by the end of the 19th century, a generation had been raised on a timeline that was never real. They believed there had been a time when the world stood still, 1,000 years without progress. Because no one taught them Tosk, who wrote this story. No textbook mentioned the secret archive. No professor asked why centuries of knowledge seemed to vanish. No one questioned whether the Dark Ages were simply a canvas painted black so that today's rulers could shine brighter by contrast. And have you noticed? In nearly every movie set in medieval Europe, the sky is always gray, the castles crumble, the roads are mud, the peasants shuffle with hollow eyes. A shadowy church looms over all. This isn't an accident. Cinema has become the world's new historian. And in the case of the so-called Dark Ages, it didn't just illustrate history, redefined it. While the textbooks of the 1800s invented the label, mass media breathed life into it. People no longer need to read a single page to believe in medieval ignorance. They've seen it. They've felt it. And that is the danger. Because what we feel deeply, we rarely question. From Braveheart to Kingdom of Heaven, from Inquisition dramas to witch-hunting thrillers, the same scenes replay: ignorance, oppression, shadow, and pain. Always the same symbols, always the same lie. And slowly, the myth becomes memory. We are rarely shown the illuminated manuscripts of Timbuktu, the advanced Islamic learning centers of Cordoba and Baghdad, or the meticulously charted maps from the East that predate European exploration. These are not the visuals we're handed. Why? Because the myth of a European Dark Age, lit only by the faint candle of the Vatican, is far too convenient. It offers a simple tale, one of shadows and a single source of light. It's digestible. It flatters the institutions that wrote it. And above all, it aligns seamlessly with the worldview those in power have curated for centuries. Once the image of medieval ignorance is embedded into our collective psyche through movies, documentaries, video games, and textbooks, any effort to challenge it feels like an act of rebellion rather than inquiry. Skeptics are labeled radicals, thinkers become conspiracists, and anything that dares disrupt the polished version of the past is dismissed before it's even heard. Yet here's the deeper truth. While Europe supposedly languished in darkness, seeds of genius were quietly blooming. Innovations in agriculture, early forms of algebra, breakthroughs in astronomy, and the architectural mastery of Romanesque and Gothic styles all took root during this dark time. Inside cloistered monasteries, intellectual ferment never truly died, but rarely are these glimpses allowed into the popular frame. Instead, the Vatican sits in its paradox, sometimes painted as secretive or corrupt, but always preserved as the lone custodian of truth in an otherwise barren world. A contradiction, yes, but a useful one. And so, a child grows up, absorbing knowledge from standardized curriculums, while unconsciously consuming hours of media reinforcing the same tale. Over time, history no longer feels like a conversation. It becomes a finished portrait framed and signed not by those who lived it, but by the studios, publishers, and institutional gatekeepers who profit from its telling. In this way, truth is not lost in shadows. It is drowned under the spotlight. For when any institution claims exclusive rights to truth, the natural response from a free society should be, "Open your vaults, show us everything." But with the Vatican, that demand has long gone unanswered. For generations, the Church has systematically seized, censored, and suppressed thousands of ancient texts, from scientific theories to rival religious doctrines. From Eastern philosophies to pre-Christian histories, many of these works ended up on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official index of forbidden books, maintained between 1559 and 1966. The list may be gone, but the censorship lingers. Most of these works were never made public again, and we must ask, why? If these books were false, let scholars refute them in open debate. If they were harmless, why the silence? And if they merely offer alternate lenses on truth, wouldn't any civilization that prides itself on enlightenment welcome such perspectives? But the Vatican chose otherwise. Deep within its sovereign borders lies the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanem, the Vatican Secret Archive. While the word secretum originally meant private, in reality it signifies restriction, not just to protect, but to withhold. Very few researchers are granted entry. Each must request a document by name. Photography is forbidden, free access is denied, and any document that challenges ecclesiastical authority remains sealed in the deepest corridors, out of reach of even the most credentialed historians. So what is being hidden? Many scholars believe these vaults hold missing links, evidence of human progress that disrupts the official timeline, records that show how pagan, Islamic, and Eastern philosophies heavily influenced early Christian thought, texts that reveal how many theological truths were shaped not by divine revelation, but by editorial alchemites. The continued secrecy isn't neglect, it's strategy. Because once those pages see the light, our understanding of history, of faith, of identity must be rewritten, not just about the Dark Ages, but about how darkness itself was manufactured. We may never know the full contents of those locked rooms, but silence maintained for centuries is never neutral. It is protective. In our digital age, no one burns books in the town square. But what does it matter if the pages are forever locked away, hidden behind doors no one can open? Suppression doesn't require fire. It only requires forgetting. And in that forgetting, the official story prevails. Still taught in classrooms, still echoed by documentaries, still whispered by tour guides in St. Peter's Basilica. Underneath its blinding light, the shadows remain unnoticed. Modern history likes to tell a tidy tale. Rome falls, the world slumbers in darkness, and then one day, the Renaissance erupts like a divine sunrise. Da Vinci dreams of flying machines. Copernicus redraws the cosmos. Michelangelo unveils divine beauty through marble. It all feels magical, but fairy tales often do. Yet pause and ask, where did this Renaissance actually begin? And why, after 1,000 years of supposed slumber, did humanity suddenly leap into genius? The textbook answer: they rediscovered Greek and Roman knowledge. But here's the mystery. Why was that knowledge lost in the first place? How did it vanish for nearly a millennium? And how did societies, still under the weight of religious control and social hierarchy, suddenly produce minds that seemed centuries ahead of their time? Again, the trail leads to the Vatican. Evidence suggests that monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and later the Jesuits, had long amassed and preserved ancient manuscripts throughout the Middle Ages, not for dissemination, for storage. And then, during the 15th and 16th centuries, As the church faced growing scrutiny and a crisis of legitimacy, these texts were strategically unveiled. They weren't discovered, they were released, curated, branded, and the world was told, "Behold, the dawn of reason." Thus, the Renaissance wasn't a step forward. It was a carefully calculated step back into a room whose door had been closed for 1,000 years. The genius of that era was real. The breakthroughs were staggering. But we must ask, how many of those thinkers were granted selective access to church-held secrets? How many navigated their work through theological filters to avoid accusations of heresy? The Renaissance was not an uncontrolled explosion of creativity. It was a permitted performance. Discoveries were allowed in stages. Innovation was bounded, and the light that emerged was filtered through a lens held by those who'd long controlled the darkness. So if what we celebrate as a rebirth was in truth a controlled release of knowledge, then the foundations of our historical narrative need re-evaluation. Perhaps knowledge was never lost. It was simply held in reserve, until the timing suited those who wished to appear as liberators. The light we revered didn't come from the horizon. It came from behind a curtain. And truth, true truth, doesn't need amplification. It doesn't need to be choreographed or repeated endlessly. In fact, it's the things repeated too neatly, too often, that deserve the most suspicion. From childhood, we're taught that history flows in a straight line, Rome, then darkness, then rebirth, then modernity. The names and dates line up, the narrative is clean, and that's exactly the issue. Because real history is not a straight line. It is jagged, filled with ruptures, distortions, and inconvenient facts. Yet what we're given is polished, coherent, and unchallenged. Dig beneath that surface, and you'll find missing pieces, questions without answers, timelines that don't fit, and achievements with no origin story. And from those absences, one final question rises like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. Has someone rewritten history? Not to deceive, but to direct it. That was always the art. And if so, who held such extraordinary power to steer not just beliefs, but the entire arc of human memory? Not kings, not sages, not even the scientists, but the church. The only institution in history to have monopolized all three pillars of civilization: knowledge, spirituality, and time itself. When the Vatican held dominion over the vast archives of ancient knowledge, when its monasteries became the only sanctioned copyists of human thought, when dissenting ideas were rebranded as heresy, when calendars were redrawn under papal authority, when sermons rewrote the past from every pulpit, then truth was no longer something discovered, it was something manufactured. History, in their hands, was not a record, it was a script. A tool to mold perception, sculpt identity, and, above all, erase memory so thoroughly that humanity forgot what it once knew. Few realize that even today, scholars question whether vast segments of recorded history actually occurred. There are uncanny repetitions, fragmentetamines, and characters so similar across eras that they appear copied and pasted. These are not wild conspiracies, but emerging academic hypotheses now resurfacing with unnerving evidence. And if they hold any truth, if our history has indeed been engineered, redacted, patched together through selective memory and dogma, then the real question isn't are we being lied to, but what, if anything, do we truly remember? Once collective memory is rewritten deep line now, and consistently enough, it ceases to be questioned. It becomes reality, one we are born into, molded by, and ultimately die believing, never suspecting that it may all have been rearranged. In every civilization, the questioners are the lifeblood of progress. They are the fault lines where truth emerges, the necessary disturbance that keeps certainty from becoming tyranny. But there is a terrible paradox. The more incisive their questions, the more society pushes them aside. Across the field of history, a quiet pattern emerges: brilliant scholars, linguists, astronomers, archaeologists, Even theologians, those who dared to question the official timeline, who noticed the cracks in the narrative, who voiced inconvenient truths, they are met with identical outcomes. Their work buried, reputations destroyed, grants revoked, and careers ended. Some disappear in the field. Some resign without explanation. Some take their own lives at the precipice of discovery. Their unifying trait: they came too close to something the Vatican and its apparatus has spent centuries keeping buried. But make no mistake, it's rarely the Vatican that moves directly. It doesn't need to. A far more subtle machinery does the silencing. Academic journals with invisible thresholds, publishing houses with hidden red lines, and research institutions gatekept by legacy dogma. There are entire realms of inquiry about ancient calendars, geographic anomalies, pre-Christian civilizations, and suppressed texts that simply never appear in mainstream discourse. Not because they are disproven, but because they fall outside the accepted framework, the illusion crafted over centuries. Independent voices claim the Dark Ages were not a period of stagnation, but one of extraordinary awakening, later buried under centuries of theological revision. Some argue historical figures were replicated under different names to populate fabricated timelines. Others contend the Church manipulated the very measurement of time through the Julian and later Gregorian calendars, mathematically consistent, yes, but politically convenient. These researchers rarely last. They are shut out, smeared, or rendered irrelevant. Not because they are wrong, but because they touched the untouchable. And that fear, the fear of touching what must remain buried, spreads like a quiet plague, until silence becomes a self-sustaining system, until young scholars stop asking, until thinking becomes an act of caution, until censorship is no longer but instinctive. For more than 1,000 years, the Vatican has stood at the summit of European civilization, an icon untouched by wars, revolutions, or collapse, a place where presidents still bow and empires once kissed the ring. A religious empire cloaked in humility yet radiating power that transcends borders and centuries. But the closer one gets to that grandeur, the more a strange sensation arises. Not that something is hidden in the shadows, but that the blinding light itself may be the veil, because beneath its surface, as a spiritual beacon, the Vatican remains the keeper of the world's largest forbidden library, millions of unreleased manuscripts, censored doctrines, and obliterated books. It is the curator of both truth and silence. It was the Church that imposed the narrative of the Dark Ages. It was the Church that destroyed knowledge deemed dangerous. It was the Church that shaped the timeline and suppressed any challenge to it. And in doing so, it turned history into something else, not a mirror, but a mask. So we must ask, is this the duty of a spiritual guide or the design of a gatekeeper? Perhaps, once, they believed they were protecting us, that mankind was not yet ready for unfiltered truth, that chaos must be avoided at the cost of inconvenient knowledge, that faith was more important than fact. But faith, without freedom of thought, is submission, and knowledge, kept hidden, becomes a weapon. If the Vatican holds the light it claims to protect, why is that light entombed beneath stone vaults? If it is the guardian of truth, why must that truth be shielded from the world? And if what they hold can transform our understanding of history, then silence is no longer holy. It is heresy. Let us be honest. The Vatican's spiritual role in world history is immense and undeniable. But so is its role in determining what parts of that history the world is allowed to remember. When any institution controls that much knowledge and reveals solitude, it no longer simply teaches, it decides. It decides who may step into the past, and when the past is sealed, the future becomes nothing but a continuation of the story they want us to believe. We are told that history flows like a river. But what if the river was redirected centuries ago, when we were never told? One of the most daring Controversial yet increasingly discussed theories in historical circles is the phantom time hypothesis. It proposes that almost 3 centuries of history, particularly between AD 600 and 900, were inserted, fabricated, or imagined, that the so-called Dark Ages never happened. And if this theory is even partially true, then the year today is not 2025, but somewhere closer to 1725. It seems impossible until you begin to look. First, the archaeological evidence from that era is disturbingly thin. Monumental gaps in architecture, literature, and verifiable records. Most of what we know about that time comes from church documents, often rewritten centuries later. Second, astronomical date eclipses, planetary alignments, comet sightings do not match the dates they're supposed to. When modern astronomers model the sky, the stars tell a different story. Some events are off by decades, others by entire centuries. So, if time itself was shifted, then so was everything. Our place in history, our view of the ancient world, our understanding of human evolution, invention, and civilization. And if that's true, what else have we mistaken as reality? Third, patterns emerge that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. Historical figures recur, like echoes appearing across dynasties under different names, yet bearing strikingly similar traits, voices, and missions. Were they truly different people, or narrative placeholders, inserted to populate artificially extended centuries? Fourth, and, most crucially, who gained from stretching the fabric of time by nearly 300 phantom years? Once more, all signs point to the Vatican. By curating history itself, the Church not only cloaked its authority in the illusion of deep antiquity, it strategically distanced the collapse of Rome from the present age, fabricating a long, dark void for humanity to emerge from. A void where doubt is swallowed by reverence. If people believe they survived 1,000 years of chaos, they are far less inclined to challenge the keepers of that tale. Ancient civilizations often used different systems to measure time. The Anno Mundi calendar, counting from the dawn of Thorold, and the Byzantine calendar placing us centuries behind today's Gregorian reckoning. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced that calendar reform, it erased 10 full days overnight, but perhaps far more was quietly altered beneath it. So who can say with certainty that the date we call 2025 is the truth? What if this modern number is an illusion and myth built atop foundations of silent omission? Not in terms of our technology or skyscrapers or satellites, but in the very structure of history itself. Imagine this: we launch AI into the stars, while the timeline beneath our feet crumbles. Because if time the skeleton of history distorted, then every layer built upon it must be re-examined. Our entire human story may be constructed on a temporal fiction. No scholar, no pope, and no AI can say with certainty what the original truth was. But the more inconsistencies emerge, the clearer one thing becomes: we are floating in time without an anchor. And perhaps we always have been. We are born into a timeline already written, a cosmic play already in motion. We open our eyes to a world that claims to be in the year 2025, surrounded by monuments and textbooks and scrolls, assuring us of thousands of years of heritage, and we accept it, because no child wishes to begin life by questioning the calendar. But sometimes the illusion flickers. There are cracks in this supposed continuity. Missing pieces, duplicate figures, silent centuries. And every time one of those fractures is examined, history doesn't just shift, it groans. The door to truth creaks open a sliver, and through that sliver, we glimpse shadows of lives erased. Progress, then, is not just forward motion, it's the ability to remember where we began. And if that origin has been edited, manipulated, or altogether invented, then we cannot truly measure how far we've come. We may be standing in a page torn from someone else's script, mistaking it for the beginning of our own. When the true past is forgotten, we lose more than memory, we lose our map. Our power to imagine the future becomes tethered to a lie. And if anything is more dangerous than forgetting, It is orchestrated forgetting. History does not demand belief. It demands inquiry. And if something within you stirred as these questions were raised, then perhaps you've stepped across the threshold into a truth older, deeper, and more unsettling than anything you were ever taught. If you believe this pursuit matters, hit subscribe, not as a ritual, but as a rebellion. Keep these cracks in the timeline alive, because sometimes all it takes is one question, one forbidden, unyielding question to fracture the vault that keeps the past sealed. Heat. Hey, heat.